Black people and other people of, not only were Black people and other people of color demanding change, white people were also demanding change. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that white people haven't been part of the struggle. They have been part of the struggle for many years. But now, more white people were demanding change more publicly and more visibly and in ways that we hadn't seen before. For many, there was a formal recognition of the existence of systemic racism, white supremacy, and the horrendous impact this has had on every aspect of Black life in America. Allyship has taken a much deeper meaning, and many have been crying out for more information and more understanding of ways that they can be anti-racist and support anti-racism efforts and end racism in our country. So today, Dr. Crystal Fleming is here with us to help us do that. She's an internationally recognized expert on racism and anti-racism. She empowers audiences to confront and challenge white supremacy. Dr. Fleming is a professor of sociology and Africana studies at SUNY Stony Brook. She earned a Ph.D. and a master's degree in sociology from Harvard University, so she has some deep roots here as well. And she graduated with honors in sociology and French from Wellesley College. A critical race theorist and author of the critically acclaimed book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, on racism, white supremacy, and the racial divide, Dr. Fleming is known for her frank talk and her insouciant use of humor. Her work and commentary are regularly featured in a range of national and international media, including Courier International, Newsweek, Black Agenda, CBS Morning Show, The Root, NPR, New York Times, among many others. She also is a bold, dynamic, and influential voice on Twitter with over 50,000 followers and millions of readers. Her tweets on racism and politics are frequently cited in outlets such as the LA Times, The Nation, Hip Hop Wired, The New Republic, Al Jazeera, Washington Post, USA Today, BET, and we could go on and on. Now, I know I am so excited to hear from her today, and I hope that you are excited to hear from her too. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Fleming and ask that you give her a virtual round of applause. Dr. Fleming?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea, for that warm welcome. Thank you to everyone who has joined us this morning for your last diversity dialogue in this series for the fall. I hope that my talk this morning will elucidate certainly concepts like critical race theory and the sort of systemic understanding of white supremacy that I think is so important for facing the continuing legacies of racial oppression in our country. But my goal is also to really encourage those of you who are already working on these issues, who perhaps are already involved in standing up against racism and working in solidarity to build a truly inclusive society and community where you are. Everywhere that I'm invited to talk, there are both of these things. There are the dynamics of racism and people who are working hard to address these issues. And so I want to acknowledge and really, hold space for that and hope that my remarks will support the work that you are doing on your campus or in your communities. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my slides and then we'll get started. Okay. So today's event in the dialogue series is called Better Understanding the Moment. The moment, what is that? Is it 2020? Is it the longue durée of white supremacy? One of the things we'll be doing in our interaction today is drawing connections between the past and the present so we can better understand what's happening now. I'm speaking with you all today, as you heard in that wonderful introduction, both as an alum, finished my PhD at Harvard almost 10 years ago, time flies, but also as a critic of Harvard, following in the footsteps of people like W.B. Du Bois and others who, sort of, had the same experience as I did, to the extent that we spent years within the Harvard system, and, sort of using the tools that we have to bring a critique of racism home to where we are and where we have been. So I, want to acknowledge my dual role, both as an educator around issues of race and racism, and specifically a critic of Harvard, in the hope that these criticisms and this critical lens can be useful for activists and advocates who are on the ground. As we get started, I also would like to specifically acknowledge the many, many people who have worked to make this event and others in the series possible, and to pivot, as we all have done, from in-person to virtual opportunities to engage. So thank you so much to Andrea, Kelton Harris, Dominique, Jessica, Otto, Chris, Mandy, Annie, Kat, so many people who made this event possible. And you, those of you who decided to show up. Over 200 people are already on the call. And I know that the kinds of folks who tend to show up for an event like this are typically folks who understand the need to have these frank and difficult conversations about white supremacy, about racism, but also to do more than talk, to actually transform our knowledge and our awareness into concrete action. And so one of the goals of my intervention this morning is to suggest some practical steps and some questions that I think we all need to be thinking about, both at the individual level and at the level of our institutions, for actually bringing about transformative efforts to change our communities and create inclusive cultures and practices and policies. So thank you to everyone who is already on that page, and those of you who are new to this topic, thank you for showing up as well. So you already heard a really long bio. I am not going to recapitulate all that, but I will say that in addition to being a professor of sociology and conducting research on racism and collective memory and communities of color in the US and in France, I also like to call myself a wig snatcher of white supremacy. So if you have not heard the term wig snatching before, you're about to understand what it means. I think it was a little bit of false advertising when we had that nice music playing in the intro. You might have been getting your boop on, because what we're going to address is uncomfortable. White supremacy and the violence of racism and racial oppression are inherently discomfiting topics. And when I snatch that wig of white supremacy, what that means is that I'm trying to reveal the truth of the situation and move beyond what I call BS DEI conversations. And I know that folks who've come in the series before me have also been committed to having that real talk about what we're dealing with in terms of racial violence, rather than resting on our laurels with the notion of diversity. So I'm going to come back to the problems with diversity as a framework, but also the opportunities for us to move the needle when it comes to racial justice. So you're about to see some wig snatching today. As mentioned, my work is on global racism and white supremacy. My first book was actually about the legacies of slavery and colonialism in France, which, I remain involved in work on racism in Europe. If anyone wants to talk about that in the Q&A, I'm happy to do so. You might also like to know that I have a line of research and reflections on mindfulness and the role of mindfulness in sustaining the well-being of people of color and Black folks and Indigenous folks. If you'd like to connect with me, you can learn more about my work at crystalfleming.com. I am too often on Twitter. My Twitter handle is always the self. If there are questions or topics that come up today that we don't get to address in the Q&A, of course, you can feel free to reach out, and you can use the hashtag of my latest book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, as well. So this is the book. It actually came out a couple of years ago, but due to the moment that we are in, the resurgent interest in and awareness about racial justice that emerged this year because of activists on the ground and organizers on the ground and protests in the streets. We saw an unprecedented level of media attention and readership around issues of racism and anti-racism. So it was in that context that there was even more of an interest in my book and other folks' books who came out years ago. As I'll get into a bit today, the book it has a number of goals. One is to demystify critical race theory for the wide public. I have been very much influenced by CRT, which has been in the news this year for reasons I will address a bit later. But critical race theory is also intimately connected to Harvard, particularly through Derek Bell's work and protests and activism at Harvard Law, and also the work of students to bring attention to white supremacy and racial oppression on our campuses and in our society more largely. And so the book aims to demystify CRT, but also to share a bit of my journey as a Black woman, as a scholar, as an intellectual who came to CRT after leaving Harvard. Even though CRT is connected to the university, I have to say, and this is not controversial, it's just a fact, CRT is not centered in the sociology department where I was trained, and in most departments, frankly. We in our country, I would say, have we have a very complicated relationship with CRT, but for those of us like me who also work on Europe and other societies and parts of the world where CRT is not at all advanced in the way that it has been in our country, I definitely understand the value of the work that activists have done to open up spaces like this for us to have these direct and important conversations about racial oppression. Even so, CRT is still in peril in our society. And we're going to talk about the political pushback, where it comes from, et cetera. But the book is sort of hopefully received as an act of public sociology, but also sharing my journey, the fact that I was not born with the Black Power fist, quoting Angela Davis, but had to learn about the history and sociology of white supremacy in a way that challenged some of my preconceived ideas and my naivete. So we'll get into some of these core concepts in a moment. So here is an overview of the remainder of my talk today and the topics I'd like to address. I'm going to get into in a bit more detail, just the convergence of multiple crises and opportunities for heightened consciousness around racism and anti-racism that emerged this year, but also the broader context that brought us to 2020. So we'll get into that. And then we're going to shift gears and address what I see as some of the problems of the diversity and inclusion framework and language that many of us are sort of encumbered with within our institutions, because this has become the phraseology that institutionalizes anti-racism work within many of the contexts where we work or we've been educated. I will critique diversity as someone, of course, who's won a lot of diversity awards and, been involved in and still very active in diversity initiatives. But what I appreciate about events like ours is that we have an opportunity to move beyond a superficial understanding of diversity and inclusion and ask hard questions about real meaningful change and what it looks like in a structural perspective. Then we're going to wig snatch white supremacy as promised, and that means revealing both sort of the history of its emergence, what it means in terms of the allocation of resources, and some tools for actually recognizing it where we work, where we live, and in society more broadly. And then as we get into the Q&A portion, I'm going to leave us with some questions and provocations and opportunities for critical reflection on what we can do, not merely as individuals, but yes, as individuals, but more importantly, in community and solidarity with others who share the value of building a more inclusive society and building the conditions for justice. And so hopefully this will also be an opportunity to renew our hope, which is something that I always quote Mariam Kaba, a well-known organizer, about, that is the need to cultivate the discipline of hope, even if the work ahead and the path ahead can sometimes be quite daunting, right? So this is what we're going to cover. Some reflections on this moment, and I just have to pause here and say, my God, 2020, which is not over yet, right? It's just the beginning of December, and we don't know what lies ahead. And of course, we know that, you know, the sort of conditions that converged and the crises that you know, have heightened our awareness about our individual and shared vulnerabilities, they're not going to magically disappear on January 1st, 2021. But this year has been particularly challenging, discomfiting, disturbing, disorienting, but also on the flip side, an opportunity to stand in solidarity, to stand up against oppression, and to try to push forward movements for social justice that have been in the making for generations. And so that's one of the main takeaways I hope that can frame our engagement today, that the moment that we're in now is historically rooted. And critical race theory is a great set of conceptual tools for understanding that longue durée, both of racism and anti-racism. So I just want to also specifically hold space to recognize that it has been the death and the killings and the violent oppression of specific Black people. And these are just two of those individuals this year who were murdered. And you know, the search for accountability and justice remains ongoing. This is an image of Breonna Taylor on the cover of Vanity Fair from a couple of months ago, a portrait of Breonna Taylor. And what you're seeing on the right side of your screen is a mural of George Floyd, actually on the Berlin Wall, speaking to the global impact of movements for racial justice and the outpouring of anguish and anger and despair and frustration that animated and continues to animate protest movements across the world. Of course, all of this happening within the context of COVID-19 and its disproportionate impact in our society on Black communities, but also Indigenous communities. You see an image here on your screen of an Indigenous woman being tested for COVID. Indigenous communities and nations have been devastated and continue to be devastated. This image actually is from Navajo Nation by COVID. And so with sprawling economic devastation, the unchecked spread of COVID, and the continued killing and oppression of people racialized as Black, all of this convergence sparked an unprecedented global reckoning. And as much as it was unprecedented, nevertheless, it still is building on movements, right? Recent movements, Black Lives Matter, and generations of civil rights and human rights activism that have been countering systemic racism and white supremacy. And so we who do this work are standing on the shoulders of the activists and advocates and everyday people who have been bringing attention to these issues and centering the well-being and the interests and the lives of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. And so again, I hope that as much as we are drawing connections between past and present racism, we can also be inspired by the example of anti-racist activists and advocates who came before us. So I mentioned at the onset of my remarks that I do have to confess to having a lot of discomfort with the term diversity. And much of that discomfort also comes from engaging the work of Sarah Ahmed, who is a brilliant theorist of power. Her work on being included is one that I come back to again and again. But Ahmed really pushes us to move beyond diversity in terms of how we think about the politics of inclusion and exclusion and oppression on our campuses. What you're seeing right now is a tweet that got a lot of traction earlier this year. Someone asked, what is the academic version of thoughts and prayers? And this is in the context of, hearing things like thoughts and prayers around, for example, the spread of COVID and other or incidents of violence, and the notion that what does this actually signify if it's an empty expression, thoughts and prayers. And when I saw this, my first thought was that diversity and inclusion is all too often the academic version of thoughts and prayers. That is a phraseology, a framework that gets thrown out that makes our institutions look far more anti-racist and inclusive than they actually are. Diversity is a word that is received in a way, and we could get into some of the pushback even against diversity, and it is a significant pushback, let us be clear. There are people and activists, white nationalist activists, who stigmatize and demonize diversity in and of itself. But for most people who are not card-carrying neo-Nazis, diversity is a word that can be received better and far more easily than white supremacy or injustice, or words that reveal the power dynamics that create conditions of inequality. So what I try to do in my work and in solidarity with others is to use the diversity frameworks that exist to push critique and push us beyond that framework so that we can do the real work of addressing the forms of violence and inequality that continue to exist. So what I'm suggesting is that diversity can sort of operate like a beautiful rug, right? That's sort of a euphemism. And words like tolerance and difference and bias, these words are easier to digest. And I say this with the caveat yet again that even these words for people who are riddled with white fragility or with resistance to addressing any aspect of diversity, these words can discomfit as well, but they're easier to digest. And what does a rug do? A beautiful rug, well, maybe it makes the room look better, puts people at ease perhaps, but also specifically what it could do is cover up the dirt, the things we don't want to see. That's the function of a euphemism, to put folks in power, especially at ease. And so what is the dirt, right? These uncomfortable realities, institutional violence, examples of institutional failures, in the specific reference to racial oppression in the United States, some of that dirt that remains taboo to address directly is the violence of colonialism, and specifically settler colonialism and the dispossession of Indigenous people, which is ongoing. White supremacy is a word that continues, even though we've seen a shift in recent years to a more public critique and discussion of white supremacy. It's a word that continues to make people uncomfortable. I have to tell you, recently I was asked to do an event about my work, and the organizers asked, well, could you talk about anti-racism but not mention white supremacy? Is that possible? Is that? No, that's not possible. And this was, an organization that was very well funded, and they were very happy to give me a fat check if I would only come talk about racism and anti-racism without mentioning the taboo of white supremacy. And why is that? Why is that? Well, white supremacy is a word that attunes us to something that most people have to admit is wrong. That is the domination of people socially defined as white, or the belief that people who are socially defined as white are superior. At this point in 2020, most people have the inclination that that's probably not okay. And there can be fear also about the reactions of fragility and the reactions of violence that come from those who would rather brush this under the rug, those who would rather allow the white supremacist status quo to persist. And needless to say, or maybe I need to say it, I turned down that talk. There's not going to be a talk for me about racism and anti-racism that doesn't address the white supremacist elephant in the room. And so in the remainder of my talk, we're going to get into what a systemic understanding of white supremacy looks like, what critical race theory has to do with it, and why it's so important for those of us who are looking to advance the cause of racial justice in our communities, in our campuses, and in our society. I love this quote from James Baldwin when I'm thinking about wig snatching and revealing the realities of systemic white supremacy. And by the way, I just love almost everything that James Baldwin said and wrote. But he said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And that is true about white supremacy as well. Sometimes when we're thinking about or talking about the continuities between white supremacy in the past and present, it can feel exasperating. How and why do we still have a society in which our economy and our politics are dominated by people socially defined as white? How could that be? And that resistance that I just referenced, that desire to, oh, well, let's not go that far. Let's not use those words, right? That desire to cleave to euphemisms or deny the racial realities in which we live, that denial, that sort of capitulation to white discomfort is part of why we still have these issues. If we can't face it, if we can't talk about it, then that allows for the dynamics and the power structure to persist. And let us be clear, there are active political forces that attempt to squash public discussion in our so-called democracy, public discussion about white supremacy and racial oppression and anti-racism. And we have numerous examples of what that squashing looks like, and we'll get to some of that in a moment, around the executive order that came out a few months ago from the current administration to essentially demonize and make illegal acknowledgements of white supremacist racism as well as sexism. So we'll get into that right now. These are some headlines that reveal some of what's been going on. If you haven't paid attention to that executive order, I'm going to give you some resources for learning more about it. But this is what put critical race theory back on the map of public discourse this year. You're seeing Cheryl Harris, who's one of the founding theorists of critical race theory, was one of the many CRT scholars and advocates who were on the front lines, writing op-eds in the public sphere, trying to correct misinformation about CRT. And here's an article on the left in the bottom corner here from the New York Times about the chilling effect of this executive order on diversity trainings. And it hasn't just been diversity trainings that are federally funded that are at stake. This executive order sought to make illegal the funding of trainings, but also research and other kinds of intellectual engagements with the topics of racial oppression, historical racism, sexism, and so on. Here from MarketWatch, Trump's crackdown on critical race theory, training leads to cancellation of Justice Department unconscious bias program. And all of this happening, right, by design in a context where, again, as we saw earlier, we have had an unprecedented outpouring of interest in anti-racism, in racial justice, in the anti-racism books, and at every step in our country's history, where we have seen advances, where we have seen a rising in consciousness around the value of Black and Brown lives, where we have seen policies challenged and changed, we have also seen pushback from the forces that wish to retain the white supremacist status quo. And this is what that pushback looks like. And if you'd like to learn more about what the African American Policy Forum calls the equity gag order that the Trump administration has enacted, you can check out the very important Truth Be Told campaign, which is being led by, among others, Kimberly Crenshaw, who I'll share more about in a moment, who of course is one of the most famous Harvard grads from Harvard Law and a critical race theorist herself, co-founder of critical race theory. And what the Truth Be Told campaign is doing is, first of all, educating people about the implications, the far-reaching implications of the gag order, and putting this into historical context around the efforts to silence activists and advocates like James Baldwin, like Martin Luther King Jr., Ida B. Wells and Fannie Lou Hamer, Derek Bell, Thurgood Marshall, Angela Davis, Kaepernick, and others. We're going to come back to MLK because I'm going to give you in a moment a definition of white supremacy that is based on, a critical race reading of history and sociology. But you will also see that Martin Luther King Jr. had a critical race understanding of white supremacy. We just don't hear about it in the Disney-fied version of King that we receive in our schools and in the public sphere. Again, check out the work being done, super important work, of the African American Policy Forum and the Truth Be Told campaign. There's a petition you can sign in solidarity with activists and scholars and community members who are speaking up about this gag order. So regarding critical race theory, here are some of the founders. Just a quick note about sort of the political and intellectual origins of critical race theory really comes out of the work of civil rights lawyers. So it comes out of lawyering practice and legal theory and then spread to other disciplines. But it was the work of civil rights lawyers grappling with how do we address the continuing policies and practices that reproduce white supremacy in a context, in a society, in a nation that increasingly frames itself as race neutral and colorblind, right? This is a monumental shift, this shift to the pose of race neutrality. That's a monumental shift in our country's history, moving from a society that was explicitly segregationist, explicitly white supremacist, to a society where officially our laws claim to have created the conditions of colorblindness. So civil rights lawyers were on the forefront of grappling with just these questions. And critical race theory comes out of that work. And you have on your screen some of the founders, Mari Matsuda, Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw mentioned earlier, whose work and activism really have created this vibrant, important, interdisciplinary body of work that has trained generations of lawyers and legal theorists, but also now is becoming more central in the work of social science and other fields, the field of education and others that are attempting to bring scholarship and advocacy into conversation and into policies and practices that can actually change the power dynamics that we're discussing. And so I want to briefly share with you some of the core features of CRT, again, to sort of debunk the I have to say the Trump equity gag order, and everyone who sort of works on issues of racism knows this to be true. That executive order basically lumps together anything that could critique white supremacy, even if it's not exactly CRT, lumps it under the umbrella of critical race theory. It's a great deal of propaganda, which plays into the interests of white nationalists. So let us see what CRT actually entails and why it's so helpful for framing our understanding of history and ongoing realities. So as mentioned, there is this emphasis, because it comes out of legal theory, on laws and policies and practices, and particularly on policies and practices that reveal themselves not to be colorblind, right? Because this is the issue of race neutrality. How do we deal with it? This kind of institutionalized denial of racial reality and racial inequalities. How do we deal with that? So there's an emphasis on storytelling as well, and telling the stories and centering the perspectives and knowledge of people who are racialized minorities in our society, and using those stories to reveal the continuing realities of racial inequities and oppression, but also to be politically engaged, right? So CRT, what's so powerful about it is that it involves the rejection of the notion that we can or should create objective knowledge that has no social value or no connection to movements for human rights and human dignity and well-being. And on the flip side, and in contradistinction to that, CRT activists really embrace the role of advocacy. And this is also, for me, one of the legacies of the impact of scholars like W.B. Du Bois and trailblazers like Ida B. Wells, who married empirical data and social science research with advocacy for the most vulnerable, and did so at a time when there were even less protections, even less recognition for Black and Brown lives than there is today. So this continued tradition of politically engaged scholarship is at the core of CRT. And this is also why it's politically targeted. The forces that would like to maintain the racial status quo are particularly attuned to targeting CRT, because CRT challenges these dynamics and does so forthrightly and directly. Interest convergence is a notion that I just want to throw out there, and we could maybe get more into it in the Q&A, but this comes from Derek Bell, and it has to do with a theory of social change and historical change around racism and sort of the role of the white majority in the cause of racial justice. What is that role? Knowing, as we do, for example, Frederick Douglass understood that power concedes nothing without a demand. So what is the role of people who are in a racially superordinate position or dominant position? Derek Bell's theory of interest convergence argued that it's when the interests of Black people and Indigenous people and people of color converge with the interests of the white majority that we see shifts in policies, in laws, in the conditions that can bring forth more justice. And so this means sort of thinking about, and it may be a discomfiting theory because it sort of requires acknowledging that our self-interests are at stake, both as individuals and as group members. Our self-interests are at stake in the cause of racial justice. And if white people do not understand how a certain kind of anti-racist policy or shift could benefit them, then it's quite unlikely that they will be involved in the cause of racial justice. As you heard in the intro from Andrea, white people have been involved in anti-racism and anti-racist activists for generations. Of course, not everybody and not most folks, but that's true for all activist movements. It's not everybody, it tends to be the minority. But the question of how you get huge shifts or shifts in policies at the macro level, for Derek Bell came back to interest convergence, that you really have to be clear-headed about the realities that white folks have to understand how they will be impacted and benefited by shifts in the racial order and in the social order more broadly. Lastly, one of the features of CRT that I find just essential in my work is this structural critique of white supremacy. And this gets to the core of one of the major misconceptions about race and racism that I address in How to Be Less Stupid About Race. That is the notion that white supremacy, well, that's just an extremist movement, or it's just a characteristic of people who embrace white nationalism or neo-Nazis. And this understanding, the superficial understanding of white supremacy, is also part of what holds us back from, seeing more widespread change. And so we need to break down what a structural understanding of white supremacy looks like. So let's do that. Let's reveal some of the historical and social realities of white supremacy and get a sense of what, even before CRT emerged, what activists like MLK had to say about white supremacy as a structure. So towards a structural understanding of white supremacy, what you're seeing now is sort of the Google image results. If you Google white supremacy, what comes up? You may notice in the middle of your screen, we're seeing some Confederate flags, we're seeing some swastikas, but also we see someone who might be a white man, not sure, but someone holding a sign saying, "Be on the right side of history, unite against white supremacy." And this is also speaking to something I alluded to earlier, that is the emergence in the public space and public discourse of a more direct critique of the white supremacist racial order in which we live, even by white people. You're seeing also some historical and present day images of the KKK. And for many people, this is the image of white supremacy, right? White extremist movements, or particular emblems like the Confederate flag. I'd like for you to take a moment and think about what understanding of white supremacy you had growing up. What did you learn about white supremacy, if anything, at school, within your family, in media? What did you associate with that term? I know for me, certainly, this is the image of the KKK. This is the image of white supremacy I grew up with. And what I have to say about this, right, in this year 2020 of reckonings, where we've seen so many statutes and monuments to white supremacy and the Confederacy be toppled, oftentimes with the support of white activists on the ground, but often led by communities of color. In this year where we have seen labels and marketing brands shift and change, Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, and this shift in not just public discourse, but representations that address the link between our symbols and our history, ongoing history of white supremacy. What I have to say about this is that all of that work is incredibly important. And some of my scholarship addresses collective memory, as I mentioned, my work in France in particular. So it's incredibly important to continue that critical work of looking at our monuments and our symbols that celebrate white supremacy and changing them. But it's also important to move beyond simply seeing white supremacy in these particular emblems, right? We have to see it there, but we also have to be able to see the power structure upon which our society was built, regardless of whether we're looking at a Confederate flag or our actual flag, right? And the point of doing so is not merely so that we can get real about whose land we're on, for example, centering the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous people. It's not just so that we can ask critical questions about the continued legacies of slavery, chattel slavery, and anti-Blackness. It's not just so that we can move beyond superficial and oppressive notions of patriotism that would seek to silence the critique of racial oppression. It's also so that we can build upon, again, the generations of activists and advocates who have been working to push our society towards the ideals of not just equality, but equity, right? Not just inclusion, but justice, not only diversity, but a truly transformed society that is cognizant of the inherent worthiness of all lives, and maybe not even just human lives, but living beings more broadly. Because if we're going to have a future on this planet, it's going to require that awareness of our interconnection, of course, as humans, but also with all life on the planet, right? So being able to speak frankly about our country's ongoing history of not just white supremacy, but other forms of oppression is essential, right? It's part of that work that James Baldwin described as essential for making change, facing these discomfiting truths, because we're also building on the work done by people who came before us to do the same, to wig snatch oppression, to call it out, but also to promote collective action to build the kind of society that we'd like to see. So let us now consider this structural definition of white supremacy. This is how I define it in my work, moving beyond this superficial notion of white supremacy as the KKK. I call that the KKK fallacy. So white supremacy, as I define it, is the social, political, and economic dominance of people socially defined as white. Again, the social, political, and economic dominance of people socially defined as white. And this dominance has a number of components, both the ideology of racial superiority that is at the heart of white supremacy, and also the policies and practices that create and recreate and sustain the allocation of resources to people socially defined as white. Now, this definition is, of course, building on the work of critical race theorists like Charles Mills, a critical race philosopher whose work has been revelatory for me. One of the things I write about in How to Be Less Stupid About Race is the experience of sitting in an amphitheater at Stony Brook University, which is where I teach, almost 10 years ago, after I'd already finished my Ph.D. I was in the midst of working on my dissertation and trying to transform it into my first book, and floundering in that process. And sitting in this amphitheater where we had Dr. Charles Mills invited to deliver a provostial lecture. And he was there to talk about his well-known book, The Racial Contract. And it was one of my first experiences consciously hearing someone describe white supremacy in this way, the structural way. And if you haven't read The Racial Contract and you have a penchant for philosophy, I highly recommend it. My notion of racial ignorance and racial stupidity, which I use in my book, is building on Charles Mills' concept of the epistemology of ignorance, and epistemology referring to sort of knowledge production and understanding, as Mills argues, that white supremacy has as its consequence a way of institutionalizing ignorance and not knowing and not facing and misrecognition. that reproduces the racial order. So Mills's work was incredibly revelatory for attuning me to a structural understanding of white supremacy. And it required for me to read his work, get into CRT, and to really understand the gaps in my own training around race and racism. And I share this too because I want to be clear, you can work on racism, you can work on even racial inequality and not engage with a critical race perspective and not address white supremacy. And I think that when we leave out the white supremacist elephant in the room, when we do not address the fact that the only system of racism that has ever actually been institutionalized in our society is a white supremacist system of power, then we cannot shift that system of power in the way that many of us would like to. So that's why it's important to be clear and specific about the historical relationship between being socially defined as white on the one hand and the allocation of resources, concrete, material, economic resources on the other. It also means that we have to look within our institutions, not just where we work, but also our political institutions and our economy, and ask who has power, right? So what has been the allocation of power within our institutions, and what has that to do with being socially defined as white? In the Q&A, we might have a broader discussion about the historical construction of whiteness. That's why the word white is in quotes here, because all of our racial categories, including whiteness, are socially constructed and made up, right? If we rewind historically, rewind the clock, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, no one who today either is identified or identifies as white would use that term in the racial sense that we have today. And that is because the idea of race is modern, particularly of the belief that we have a biological belonging that can be understood in terms of our race and our phenotype. These are new concepts. And they are also particularly pernicious and difficult to uproot because of the ways in which we've been socialized to naturalize race and racial belonging. But also at the core of the idea of race is a hierarchy. And specifically in our society, even though we've seen a shift in who counts as white, who's understood as white, what kind of racial hierarchy exists among those understood as white. So for example, early in the 20th century in the United States, it was still common to hear in the public discourse references to white races, plural, and particularly in xenophobic discourses directed against Italian immigrants and Irish immigrants and Jewish people from Europe being framed as less than in the hierarchy of whiteness. So even though we've seen that, and it's important to have an acknowledgement of that complexity of what the category of whiteness means, what hasn't shifted over time is the association between whiteness and resources. And we're going to get into some of the empirics of what that looks like today. So what I'm sharing with you might seem like this is just a critical race perspective, and is this some kind of extreme reading of our society? Well, let's take a look at Martin Luther King. And again, this is not the quote that you probably grew up with hearing about mountaintops or the color of one's skin, but it has to do with King's structural understanding of white supremacy. And this is exactly the structural understanding that we see practiced in critical race theory. So in 1967, his book, Where Do We Go From Here? MLK wrote the following, that the doctrine of white supremacy was embedded in every textbook and preached in practically every pulpit. It became a structured part of the culture, right? A structured part of the culture. And so that means white supremacy is not just in white nationalists or neo-Nazi movements, it's there too. White supremacy is not just in the extremist margins. It's also in the fabric of our culture and in sort of the structure of our society. And it's that way by design, right? So this is not, a mistake, just sort of randomly ended up being a white supremacist society. It's also not by fate. It's not that this, had to be the way it is. It's that for generations, people in power, in positions of power, actually made decisions that created this power structure and sought to maintain it. And along the way, people like Dr. King and others have been here to call it out and to challenge it. And they've also been marginalized for doing so. And those of us who continue the work of those who came before us, similarly are pushing up against the racial denial that continues to sustain too much of the racial status quo. I love Ida B. Wells for her courage, for her advocacy, both as an anti-lynching activist, journalist, newspaper owner, and outspoken critic of racial violence. One of the quotes that inspires me from Ida B. Wells is that the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And when we do the work of turning that light of truth on uncomfortable realities, there are going to be people who will push back. There will be people who do not want to hear it. And they, in some cases, might not even fully understand their own fragility, their own defensiveness. And one of the things we learned from advocates like Ida B. Wells, like King, and others, is that to do this work of turning the light of truth upon our racial realities, we have to be in community and solidarity with each other. This is not just about individually calling out racism. It's about being a part of racial justice movements. It's about organizing. It's about identifying allies and working in solidarity to create structural change. That is what sustains us. That is what has created the opportunities and the sort of openings for inclusion that have made possible my being a professor, my having the right to vote, both as a woman and as a Black American, and the advances that we've seen in our society would not have been possible without collective action. So we're going to come back to that in our conclusion and in the Q&A. How can we sort of combine racial literacy and individual efforts to improve our society with collective action? So let's continue to look at what white supremacy as a structure, actually, how it manifests in our society. If we're thinking about education, given that we're virtually at Harvard today, I think it's important to acknowledge the ways that our hierarchies become whiter and whiter the higher you get. This is showing you the percentage distribution of faculty by race and ethnicity. The data are from 2016. And what you can see is that at the highest level, and these numbers will not surprise, I don't think, anyone on this call, but at the highest levels of full professors, we see that 54% of those professors are white men, 27% are white women, and that number, right, is the highest at the highest level. And when you get to the more vulnerable instructors and untenured professors, this is where we see the numbers dip. But even there, African Americans, Indigenous people, Latinx, people of color are severely underrepresented. And let us be clear, representation is not enough. It's not simply that we need to diversify our ranks at the highest level. It's also that our cultures and our policies and our practices and our values have to shift and change. And this is why tokenism is also one of the enemies of racial justice. And tokenism too often becomes the form of diversity that institutions cleave to, that, if we can hire an African American, or if we can hire an Asian American, or if we can hire someone who appears to add diversity, then job well done. And no, of course, job not well done. Representation is important. That is, we actually do have to diversify leadership and every sphere of our society, but we also have to change our cultures and our policies and politics. And I hope, at least having had a Black president whose administration we can reflect on, that has allowed for people to understand that merely diversifying is not enough, that we actually also have to address policies and practices, and that people of color in positions of power can reinforce racist practices, or they can push back against them. In terms of political dominance, what do we mean about white supremacy and sort of the allocation of leadership positions and authority and resources to people socially defined as white? Well, white people represent 60 to 77% of the population, depending on whether you're including Latinx or Hispanic whites or not. But they hold 90% of elected offices. White men, if we were to take an intersectional perspective, bringing in racism into conversation with sexism and patriarchy, white men only represent 31% of the population, but hold 65% of elected offices. We have a so-called criminal justice system where 95% of all elected prosecutors are white. And again, it's not that if we had more prosecutors of color or Black prosecutors that suddenly our problems would disappear. If we have a justice or injustice system that enacts violence against marginalized people, including people of color. If you have a Black prosecutor in such a role, that doesn't erase that structural reality. But nevertheless, the fact that 3 out of 5 US states have 0 Black prosecutors, I mean, these are just egregious forms of exclusion that prevent us from seeing the kind of real structural change that would build the conditions of justice. In terms of economic dominance, what does that look like? Well, white households on average hold 12 to 13 times more wealth than African-American families. And speaking of Obama, as I mentioned, and I do mention our former president because there's a whole chapter about racial ignorance in the Obama era in How to Be Less Stupid About Race. But one of the things I like to remind people is that, you know, there was this outpouring of colorblind naivete after Obama was elected. And there were people for a while who were cleaving to post-racial discourse and believing that, oh, we've sort of gotten over that racism thing. But what was going on in Washington, D.C. when we had a Black president? Well, at the time, research has shown that white households in DC, Obama's neighbors at the time, they were 81 times more wealthy, 81 times more wealthy than Black households. And the racial wealth gap grew under our former president and continues to grow. And so let us be clear, I want to acknowledge that the racial wealth gap is a major problem, but the wealth gap writ large is a major problem. Wealth inequality is and has been aggravated during COVID-19. And W.B. Du Bois, one of my intellectual heroes, despite his flaws, because we all have them, but W.B. Du Bois was also in the forefront of really drawing critical connections between white poverty and impoverishment and the overall structure of white supremacy and the cause of racial justice. And what did he argue? Well, one of his many prescient arguments was that white elites who benefit the most economically from our current and the past power structure, that one of the strategies they use to maintain their position of power is to convince white people who are economically marginalized to look at Black people and Indigenous people and people of color as less than. This is what Du Bois called the psychological wages of whiteness, that even if your actual wages are not great, you can look to racial others from the ideology of white supremacy and feel better, and that in and of itself helps sustain the power structure. So I share this just to sort of attune us to the realities that, yes, the racial wealth gap is immoral, it's wrong, but so is the wealth gap writ large. And it has never been more important to really draw connections between the cause of racial justice and economic justice more broadly. Before we move on, I also just want to bring your attention to this chart. This is data from 2013, but just gives you a sense of what the wealth gap looks like even when we have educational parity. And even when Black and Latinx people attain some college education. So on the left side of your screen, you see that whites with less than high school education, they have had a median wealth of almost $19,000. But look at Blacks with some college, only 11,000. So this means that white Americans with less than high school educational attainment, on average have a higher wealth, more wealth than Blacks with some college. And if you look at those white Americans and African Americans and Latinx people who all have some college, the chasm in wealth is enormous. So 79,000, over 79,000 in median wealth for white households under the age of 55, compared to, again, only 11,000 for Blacks and only 20,000 for Latinx people. And here's the thing, even if, and this is so important to understand, Diva Pager's work, Diva Pager, who passed away suddenly and tragically not very long ago, but Diva Pager and other scholars have shown that even if you were to completely eliminate present day racial discrimination, these disparities would not disappear, because we have not just what's going on in this moment, we have the accrual of generations of policies, forms of discrimination that have created the gaps that we are still living with today. So these gaps did not come out of nowhere, right? They didn't fall from the sky, and they're not merely or even primarily sustained by present day discrimination that aggravates these dynamics. It doesn't create them. This is the result of historical policies and practices that have created and sustained white supremacy. If you're thinking about workplace discrimination, and I know that most of our audience members today are staff in FAS, so if we're thinking about different kinds of workplace discrimination that I hope we can address also in the Q&A, it won't surprise you, hopefully, to understand that it remains, that is racial discrimination, particularly against Black people and people of color, remains rampant throughout our society. This data is from 2018. I do think it's worth acknowledging, and perhaps we could talk about in the Q&A, that 14% of white Americans feel that they have been discriminated against in the workplace. And we might think about what that looks like, the claim of being racially discriminated against as a white person, which, by the way, is an increasingly important discourse to pay attention to, particularly those of us who work in higher education, but it's important for all of us in our society more broadly. That is the claim of reverse racism. This has actually been key to overturning advances from affirmative action, framing affirmative action as racist against whites, or even the gag order, the Trump equity gag order, as framing anti-racism trainings as racist against white people, right? That is also at stake in the perception that some whites have that they are a victim in our society. But, that's something we could get into more in the Q&A. But The numbers here demonstrate that 48% of Blacks and 36% of Hispanic people, which, by the way, we should have the caveat as a sociologist, I have to acknowledge Hispanic is not a racial category. There's a debate around that, but I understand it as an ethnic and ethno-racial category. But nevertheless, those numbers are much larger than whites who claim to have been discriminated against in the workplace. I think it's also important to understand that nevertheless, still 43% of Blacks and 52% of Hispanics say that they have not been discriminated against in the workplace. And we could talk about that as well. So what are the historical roots of white supremacy, the structural inequality that's been baked into our culture and is a structured part of our culture, to use the words of Dr. King again? Of course, the context, the historical context, as mentioned earlier, settler colonialism, the dispossession of indigenous people, slavery, chattel slavery in our country, and the emergence of racial capitalism. These are really pillars of our racial order. But we can also kind of have more resources for understanding the historical emergence of modern racism and the ideology of race as we know it today. One of the best books on the subject that I use as a teaching tool is George Fredrickson's Racism, A Short History. But it really explains the emergence of modern racism in Europe and helps us better understand what the history of anti-Semitism has to do with the emergence of the idea of race and racial inferiority and racial belonging as biological. Fredrickson makes the argument that anti-Semitism emerged before racial anti-Blackness in Europe, and that both converged in the emergence of the idea of race and the practice of racial oppression as Europe engaged in colonial domination. In our country, citizenship and access to political power has from the start been very much linked, explicitly so, to white racial belonging. The Naturalization Act of 1790 was our country's very first legal policy that pertained to defining who could become a naturalized citizen if you were undocumented. And that policy was explicitly white supremacist insofar as it restricted naturalization to free white persons. And I have to say, free white persons is a term that at the time excluded even white women. Only white men were legally allowed to naturalize individually. White women could do so through marriage to white men. So whites only citizenship, the idea that this should be a white country, sort of white nationalism, unfortunately, quite unfortunately, was embedded in some of our founding practices, policies, and ideologies. We could also have a conversation about xenophobia, racialized xenophobia that, as mentioned earlier, was also directed towards European ethnic groups that were defined as racially inferior, including the Irish and immigrants from Italy and Jewish Europeans. However, we need to also acknowledge that those racially marginalized whites were not excluded from being able to naturalize as white citizens. So that's an important caveat as we think about white racial hierarchy. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had the effect of barring immigration from China, and then xenophobic policies were expanded to ban immigration from almost all other countries, especially those outside of Europe. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act persisted for over 50 years, and we have had more attention in the context of COVID-19 to anti-Asian racism and the fact that it remains salient. But I think there's not enough historical awareness around how deeply rooted racist ideology and practices have been in our country, specifically directed also towards people of Asian descent. We could talk about land and real estate, the fact that 270 million acres of land were given, right, stolen from indigenous people and given almost exclusively to whites through the 1862 Homestead Act. We think about, where did that racial wealth gap come from? This is a glimpse into its historical roots. Reconstruction is an era that we all have to continue to learn from. On the heels of the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War, this period where the newly freed former slaves experienced continued disenfranchisement and being subject to eventually Jim Crow segregation, right, and Black codes. And then the rise in lynching, which Ida B. Wells played such a huge role in bringing awareness to. Of course, our academic institutions, including Harvard, played a role, an important and shameful role in disseminating scientific racism, the use of science to bolster belief in white superiority, eugenics, right? This is also something that W.B. Du Bois was exposed to as a student at Harvard. And I like to point people to the work of Ira Katz-Nelson, the important book, When Affirmative Action Was White, so that we understand, again, these historical precedents in the racist implementation of the New Deal and the GI Bill that created opportunities for people socially defined as white to move into the middle class while leaving behind Black veterans and people of color from economic opportunities systematically. So this is not everything, but I wanted to at least put up on the slide some historical roots for us to think with as we grapple with understanding, where did this structure of power come from? Why does it persist? And what can we do to tell the truth about it, but also take collective action to build a society far more inclusive than the one that some of our founders conceived. So that brings us to the last portion of my remarks before we get into the Q&A. How do we think about creating anti-racist change? Because we're dealing with centuries of policies and practices and discrimination and stigmatization, but we're also dealing with and building on centuries of anti-racist activism, of bravery, of courage, of collective action. And I hope that the questions that I'm going to put up on the screen in a moment and the points of critical reflection can help us think about how to use our sphere of influence and get involved in or sustain our work in anti-racist change. Angela Davis is amazing. And pardon me, over the years, I've had an opportunity to hear her speak, both in the United States and in France, where I've told you I have done research and have lived a few years. And some years ago, I had an opportunity to hear her speak in a suburb outside of Paris, where she was in solidarity with people of color and activist groups advocating against, well, advocating for Black lives in France and a reckoning with colonialism. And one of the things she said, this I believe was in 2015, she was talking about abolition, which has gotten so much attention this year, well-deserved attention. Angela Davis has been on the forefront of abolition for quite some time. And she told the audience, when it comes to thinking about not just abolition, but political change more broadly, even if it seems impossible, demandez l'impossible. And in English, that means ask for the impossible. It means that if we're not willing to imagine beyond the limitations, not just of our history, but of the forms of oppression that persist today, if we can't imagine beyond them, then we can't build a better world. And so part of the work of anti-racism is to be bold enough to imagine the kind of change we'd like to see, even if it seems impossible, even if it seems insurmountable, because people before us did that, right? To create the opportunities that we are living in. It required seeing beyond the institution of chattel slavery, seeing beyond the exclusion of women and people of color from voting rights and civil rights, seeing beyond the expression and public celebration of white supremacy, from our educators and preachers, as Martin Luther King discussed, seeing beyond those limitations to imagine the kind of change that would actually create the conditions of justice. As we think about those conditions of justice, I do want to elevate the work of other abolitionists, in addition to Angela Davis, from whom I'm learning a lot. Mariame Kaba, I mentioned before, is someone whose work is, as an educator and organizer, is very inspiring to me. This is one of her many op-eds this year. She's just been involved in so much advocacy work that is getting a lot of national and even international attention. But her op-ed in the New York Times this summer, in the midst of these global protests, yes, she wrote, "We literally mean abolish the police, because reform won't happen." There's a new book coming out next year by Angela Davis, Gina Dent, and Beth Ritchie and others, Abolition Feminism Now. You probably want to pre-order it. And Andrea Ritchie's work, Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. So as we think about the kinds of changes we can make in our immediate surroundings, in our workspace, in our communities, in our campus, in our families, in our relationships, in our politics, I also want to hold space for the role of a radical imagination and the discipline of hope, right? Which is something that I have had to cultivate, to go back to Kaba's quote, that hope is a discipline. I just want to share a quick story. I had an opportunity to meet Mariame Kaba for the first time some years ago, and at the time was really feeling quite overwhelmed with despair about the realities of racial violence that we've been discussing and you've been hearing about. And she told me, "Crystal, you have to have some kind of hope, some optimism." And I looked at her and I was like, "Why? Where is it? What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, you're an educator. You're an educator. So I know that in working with your students, you have some optimism." And that insight from Mariame Kaba was an opening and an opportunity for me to acknowledge that in my work in the classroom with students, with people in the community, when I'm engaged in education and also learning as an educator from working with students and community members, that is part of what certainly sustains my hope. And so whatever it is for you, and I think being in community is a huge part of that discipline of hope. We can inspire each other, and we also can acknowledge the impact of the work that we do, even as we grapple with the continuities of oppressions that we're trying to transform. So here, as promised, are some critical reflections that I'd like you to think about. If you'd like to jot some of them down for further reference, you can do so for reference in the Q&A. I'm going to put them up one at a time, these points of reflection. So the first is for those who identify as white. If you identify as white, I'd like you to think about these questions. How does white supremacy manifest within your personal and work lives? Doing this work of wig snatching white supremacy right where you are, we have the tendency again to sort of think of white supremacy as something over there with the extremists. But if you have an opportunity to reflect upon the power dynamics of where you live and work, how does white supremacy manifest? And do you actively acknowledge in any context your racial privilege and challenge racism? And if so, what does that look like? One of the things we know, both from whiteness studies and anti-racism work, is that when white people do stand up, when they stand up against racial oppression, they too experience pushback, right? And that pushback can look like everything from verbal deflection or aggression to having their lives imperiled. If you think of Heather Heyer, for example, being on the forefront of anti-racist protests and losing her life. Now, usually is not that, but it can include that full range of pushback and full range of forms of violence. And I would say that if you begin to, or if you've already been involved in the work of anti-racism, you will experience that pushback. And I'm curious, for those of you who identify as white and have started to do the work or been doing the work for a long time, What does that pushback look like, and how have you dealt with it as you actively challenge racism? Now, if you identify as a Black person or Indigenous person or a person of color, I'd like you to think about one question in particular. What resources and systems of support do you need to thrive? What do you need to thrive? I think one of the failures of our institutions when it comes to addressing race and racism specifically is a failure to ask Black people and Indigenous people and people of color what we need, and then to give it to us, right? But we're also not often put in a position of being invited to reflect on this question. What do I need to thrive? Sometimes people wonder about issues of hiring and recruitment. How do you get people of color into your organization? In addition to resources, it's important to ask what people need and want and give it to them to the extent that that's possible and actionable. So I'd like you to think about what specific resources and support would you need to thrive? And if you already have some, what is helping you within your work or your community context? And then for everybody, a whole lot of questions here that I hope can provide a framework for thinking through anti-racist change. I'd like you to think about the extent to which anti-racism is integrated into your work responsibilities and also criteria for promotion and advancement. Very often events like this one and opportunities for critical reflection are entirely voluntary, and there is something to that. The research on diversity work and anti-racism trainings and bias trainings suggest, and this is some of the work from Harvard sociologist Frank Dobbins in the department, where I was trained, sociology. But Dobbins shows that, and his colleagues have shown, that when bias trainings are forced upon employees, that they tend to be less effective. So they suggest that a sense of agency and buy-in is critically important. And so that's why it is vital to have opportunities for people to select in to conversations. But their work also suggests that sort of opportunities for ongoing learning, for example, kind of resembling what you get in a college course where you might have 15 weeks or 12 weeks of opportunities for reflection and education and growth, that's far more effective potentially than the one-off required trainings, et cetera. But so thinking about the extent to which opportunities for anti-racist reflection are integrated into what you do in terms of your requirements and promotion, to what extent do you center the knowledge and voices and diverse needs of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, knowing that none of these groups are monoliths, right? And have you done the work of identifying anti-racist allies? Because without those allies, our work will not be effective, because we have to work in solidarity with others. And finally, and this is such an important question for our institutions, what systems of accountability exist or need to be implemented to hold not just the institution, but also colleagues and community members accountable with regard to racism and anti-racism? It's all well and good to reflect. It's all well and good to have trainings. It's all well and good to have opportunities to educate. We also have to get real about accountability. And what could that look like? What's the current state of accountability? And what do we need to learn from the perspectives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color to create and sustain systems of accountability? So I'll give you a moment if you need to jot down any of this, and then we're going to wrap up and then open for the Q&A. Okay. So what's the takeaway? One of the takeaways from my talk, I hope, is that racial literacy and, yes, wig snatching white supremacy in our racial order and getting real about what it is and how it manifests structurally, that knowledge has to be brought into convergence with collective action to bring about anti-racist change and transformation. So it's always a question of identifying our sphere of influence, identifying allies, and working in solidarity to bring about the kind of change we'd like to see. I'd like to leave you with this invocation and invitation, that is that we have the power, we collectively, not merely as individuals, but we have the power to imagine and build a better world. And it is this hope that sustained those who came before us and that can help animate the work that we have to do over the longue durée, right? We have to be involved not just in an anti-racist workshop or a diversity conversation, but in the lifelong commitment to social justice that racial justice is a part of. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you so much for showing up today. If you want to connect with me on social media, you can holla at Always the Self, and you can use the hashtag for the book. And I look forward to engaging with you now in the Q&A. Thank you. So, Andrea, I see you speaking, but we can't hear you, just so you know. You're muted. There you go. Oh, you're muted again.
Okay, can you hear me now? Oops.
Yes, we hear you. Well, we did hear you, but now you're muted again, Andrea.
Okay, how is it now?
We're good.
Great. Okay, great. Well, Crystal, thank you so much for that marvelous presentation. We have 2 minutes left for questions and answers. And so I have one here that I'm going to ask you. It's a little long, so I'll try to read most of it. A long but interesting question. One thing I noticed in your talk was your wording and phrasing. In particular, you use the words people socially defined as white. To me, that's a powerful distinction. I hold many identities: multiracial, Asian American, Hispanic, white, Pacific Islander, Jewish, and more and more. I'm extraordinarily privileged, but at the same time, I struggle with discrimination and how Japanese internment has impacted my family through culture loss, fear. My grandmother was in an internment camp. My question: what is your advice to someone who doesn't know their socially defined race? How can I be cognizant of intersectionalism and multiracial people, but also recognize my privilege? With regard to your mention of systems of accountability that hold your institution and colleagues accountable, what role do you think university unions can and should play in explicitly anti-racist efforts?
Wow. First, I just want to acknowledge how powerful those reflections are and how important that question is. So thank you so much. Oh, you can't hear me?
I think I can hear you,
Okay.
Dr. Fleming.
Okay, so I want to acknowledge how powerful those reflections are, and thank you for that those questions and for sharing your own familial experience of internment and the violence of the internment of Japanese Americans. My partner, this is something I write about in the book. There's a chapter on interracial love and what does that mean? And one of the things I write about is my experience getting to know my partner, who is multiracial herself. She is Japanese and white American. And, you know, certainly not the first multiracial person that I've known, but it's been over the almost 8 years that we've been together, an opportunity for me also to learn more about what it's like on an intimate level to be someone who does not fit in to clear, you know, sort of preconceptions of race in a way that when I move throughout the world, I'm usually racialized as Black. That depends to some extent on context. When I leave the country, my racial belonging is sometimes questioned, but that's another story. But so the question of what do you do when you're not quite sure of where you fit in? I think first of all, and I talk about a lot about this in my classes on racism and ethnic relations. I think first of all is to acknowledge that no one really fits into a racial hierarchy or system because the categories are made up. And I think the more that we learn also about the history of racial categorizations and how groups who are, who identify as mixed or who identified as mixed, how they've been treated and labeled throughout our history, and sort of how racial ambiguity has been articulated with our racial conditioning and our racial hierarchy. There's a whole literature on mixed race studies that I think you might find interesting and that could resonate with you. And there's also the topic or the theme of being white passing. So I heard you mention privilege. I don't know if you felt that you have white privilege or white passing privilege or another kind of privilege. We could also talk about the privileges of colorism that affect people of color, even those who do identify as Black or Asian American or Latinx and so on. So I would say first that resources around mixed race identities and the history in our country of racial categories could be helpful for you. I will mention one specific book and resource that I think is useful for those of us also who have complicated family histories due to immigration. And it's a book I'll put in the chat called The Ethnic Project. I think I can put this in the chat, or if someone could do it for me, I don't know if I can reply to everyone. But it's called The Ethnic Project by Vilna Bashi Treitler. I can put it in the chat, so I'm just going to do that. It's a great book that includes, a sort of case histories of immigration in the United States and histories of mixture between groups defined differently in terms of race, and helps us better understand how immigrant assimilation and incorporation has been historically implicated with white supremacist policies and anti-Blackness. So again, The Ethnic Project by Vilna Bashi Treitler. And thank you for your question.
Great answer. Thank you, Crystal. Another question. Can you address accountability at Harvard? We have many task forces and hiring guidelines, but what else do we need to do?
I think Harvard and other institutions, including my own at Stony Brook, they need to think about accountability and change at the very highest levels. So for example, I believe it's true that Harvard has never had a president who's not white. This remains true of Stony Brook University and far too many of our institutions in higher ed. That is, again, going back to that chart where we saw that the most diversity tends to be lower within our organizations. And as you move higher up, we see less. And I think it's difficult for Black folks and Indigenous people and people of color to take diversity and inclusion initiatives seriously when we see that that white supremacy power structure at the top has not shifted. So I think in accountability, and again, it's not just about superficial diversity. You get a person of color in the presidency and problem solved, but frankly, I mean, it's one of the lowest bars, right? And even that our institutions haven't jumped over. So I think continuing to push for change at the highest level is important. And also, one of the political realities we sort of see, no matter what institution we're talking about, whether it's Harvard or elsewhere, is that protest, both within the institution and outside of it, is key to creating pressure that enacts change. Derek Bell, who I mentioned earlier, and many of you know about Derek Bell's famous protest at Harvard Law, where he essentially stopped teaching in order to bring attention to the marginalization and exclusion of Black women at Harvard Law. That had a huge impact on his career. He eventually had to leave the university, so it was a price to pay for that protest. But he used his position and power to put everything on the line to create change. There was an institutional impact to that protest and to those who joined in solidarity with him. And so many of us who are in education and who are people of color who do work on racism or Black studies or critical race theory would not have our jobs unless students protested, right, to create conditions of accountability and change. So protest movements on and off campuses are hugely important to creating conditions of pressure that can oftentimes create shifts in the right direction.
Great, thank you. I have a question. I'm going to sneak in one more question. And this question is dealing with allyship. And says allyship is a work in progress, as our awareness is always being confronted and heightened. Do you have suggestions on how Black, Indigenous, people of color individuals can continue to use trust and relationships within the institution to raise consciousness without fatiguing interested allies?
That last part is interesting. Okay, I want to make sure I've heard correctly. Without fatiguing interested allies. Gosh, you know, if you consider yourself an ally and you are fatigued by discussions like ours or work around racial justice, then I'm not sure it's appropriate to call yourself an ally. No matter how, how fatigued do you think Black people and Indigenous people and people of color are with oppression? I'm sorry, I understand the question though, because I think there is, in this year of unprecedented interest in anti-racism books, and we were seeing more white people join in some of the protests more than before, publicly taking a stance against racism. We've also seen attention wane for some of those folks. And I think there is, I'm seeing some discourse, in activist and advocate circles around allyship fatigue. But I would say that's not allyship. What that is sometimes is performative anti-racism. And I think I have to also say that I know there's been a lot of hand wringing over what happened to the millions of people who read the anti-racism books or who bought them. We don't know that they read them. They bought the books. We don't know, they might be in a pile, in their bedrooms. But I think it's also important to understand that in any kind of activist movement, it's always the minority that push the needle, that push for change. It doesn't particularly bother me, although maybe I'm just cynical in some respect, but I didn't expect all, 2-3 million people who bought the anti-racism books to all suddenly become Ida B. Wells. But what I expect is that our work, the work that we're doing and this kind of dialogue, the work that you may be doing in terms of anti-racist advocacy in your community or at Harvard, that work is about doing something very specific. That is building the critical mass, because it doesn't take everybody. It does not take everybody. And I think that also can help us sometimes when we might feel overwhelmed by the enormity of the problems that we're dealing with. But we don't have to change everybody. We have to increase the sphere of, or the margin of people who are aware and encouraged to engage in anti-racist change, knowing that there are going to be people who join protests or who buy books who then fall to the wayside. But even that, I think, is important to acknowledge as a shift. We've never had more people in our country publicly acknowledge, even if it was just for a moment, hey, you know what? I need to learn about racism. That, I don't want to celebrate that as some kind of, huge civil rights milestone. It isn't, but it's part of the cultural shift we need to have if we are to sort of disrupt this power structure that Martin Luther King understood was embedded in our cultural fabric, right? And we sort of have to, at least for me, develop a thick skin when it comes to the understandable disappointment about, well, what happened to all the people? Even if, you know, a fraction of those who bought the books or showed up at the protests are now educated and inspired to act, that is part of building that critical mass. So that's the way I view it. And I think it takes some of the pressure off in terms of thinking, well, we have to get everybody. No, you don't have to get everybody. We have to help bring more people to the anti-racism barbecue, but we don't have to get everybody to the barbecue.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And we want to be mindful of time. We want to thank you so much. There are several other questions that I'm going to sort of put you on the spot here and ask, can I send them to you? And if you'd be able to respond to them for us.
Yeah, I would put again in the chat too, my handle on Twitter, if anyone had a question that they'd like to continue the conversation.
Okay.
And yes, feel free to connect with me if you want to send some more questions.
Right, and this will be recorded as well. So I just want to take the last 5 minutes to close down a little bit. Thanks, Andrea and Crystal. And this is Chris Ciotti. I think most everyone on the call knows me. And I always end our dialogues by thanking Claudine Gay and Leslie Kerwin for allowing us and supporting us financially and otherwise to have these conversations. And I always thank everybody on the call, because we all, especially me, realizes how busy, especially this time of year, everybody is. And so we're really deeply grateful that you've chosen to be with us today. And I mean that every day, and I especially mean it today. This is a difficult topic. It's probably, I mean, we've had our, as Andrea said, we had our highest number of folks joining us today, you know, close to 300, over 300 actually registered, because it's a topic for all the right reasons that needs discussion and awareness and education. And at the same time, it's such a difficult topic to talk about because there's so many perspectives and it's very emotional, and many of us come to it from very different places. And so today, Crystal Fleming, thank you so much for joining us. I would like to even say we'd like to have you continue to be with us, because this is the beginning of a journey of understanding for all of us, for taking time today to educate us and inform us and make us aware, so we can begin to have these conversations, which are so meaningful to us. What we've always tried to do with our dialogues for the 10 plus years that Andrea has been spearheading them is to provide a safe place to talk about issues, of diversity and inclusion and equity and belonging that are important, that often, would not get the attention that they deserve unless there was a safe place people could go to talk about them. So, and again, I think this is another example of that. But again, we thank you for just sharing with us the information that you did about how systemic racism exposes us to racial ignorance, and then how we can begin to think about transforming that knowledge into anti-racist change. Andrea, thank you as always for spearheading this event and this dialogue and all of the other dialogues. I also want to mention our team, my folks in the FAS HR Diversity Committee, Dominique Bocanegra and Jess Bound, Annie McGaw, Kat Bliss. I know, we all know this wouldn't have happened without you, so thanks very much. After the new year, we're going to share more information about our spring diversity dialogue. And meanwhile, we hope to keep the conversation, the awareness, the education, the training, and the harder conversations that we'll have about anti-racism ongoing. And again, a final thank you to Crystal Fleming. I could have listened to you for another 2 hours, and I'm sure other folks could as well. Thank you, everybody. Go in peace. Wonderful holidays. And once again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you, Crystal, so much.
Thanks for having
Thanks,
me,
Crystal.
everybody.
Great seeing you again.
Great to see you,
too. Thanks for
Crystal.
Thank you.
there.
Oh, so good to see you.
Amazing.
Stephanie,
That was
thank you so
amazing.
much.